All right, after a long hiatus, let's continue with the E. Michael Jones Jewish Revolutionary Spirit review. Picking up where I left off, we can start with chapter 16. This is a pretty short chapter, just covering a little bit of the post-Civil War South and how lynching became more of a phenomenon, coupled with the rise of groups like the NAACP. Jones starts by giving kind of an overview of the book The Klansman, which inspires the movie Birth of a Nation later on. And Jones is actually quite critical of this book because it kind of, in his view, elevates race over religion and sees the kind of white advocacy of groups like the KKK as being revolutionary in nature rather than being conservative, and is just skeptical that racialism can really give anyone kind of like a moral grounding, and that believing in biological determinism, oh, whites are like this, blacks are like that, it just kind of devolves into chaos more or less. I don't know if I'm necessarily generalizing that correctly, but his views probably haven't changed much. You can see his debate with Jared Taylor on this issue. He's definitely known as a guy who cares a lot more about religion than race, and frankly doesn't even really believe in race as a concept. But regardless, he describes the post-Civil War era in the South and like post-Reconstruction era as a time where lynchings were kind of on the rise, and that because of this there were groups that arose to combat this, creating a dialectic between the two, similar to how there was the abolitionism versus pro-slavery dialectic. Something that kind of strikes me is that he tries to, it seems, be kind of neutral about these types of things, that, you know, lynching is just as bad as the excesses of movements like, or organizations like the NAACP and like Jewish radicals in them or something. I find it kind of bizarre, but whatever. But yeah, the group that he points to as the main organization founded in response to this kind of violence is the NAACP, which was started by a lot of white Gentiles and white Jews. People like Oswald Garrison Villard, who was the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, obviously Gentile there, but also points to people like Anna Strunsky and the Spingard brothers, Jews who were also prominent early on in the NAACP. And he demarcates this time as the start of the Black Jewish Alliance, which is kind of like a famous phrase or saying of the kind of relationship that Jews and blacks had. A lot of Jews were prominent in the civil rights era and saw black suffering as kind of akin to what they were going through in Russia. Books like The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews kind of goes over this, the book by the Nation of Islam, but kind of in a critical way. And there's been like various writings about it from radical, like black Marxist types who don't really like the paternalism of certain Jews. But there's kind of a controversy around that, and I mean, obviously not everyone feels the same about that topic. I kind of delve into this in my video on Kevin McDonald's chapter in his book Culture for Critique, if you want to check that out. And just for the rest of the chapter, he brings up W.E.B. Du Bois and how he had kind of a rivalry with Booker T. Washington, and how this was, at least in Jones' view, inspired by the radicalism of the Spingard brothers. I'm not super privy on the actual history of that. I think Jones kind of downplays Du Bois's own like personal views and agency, but he has various quotes kind of showcasing the Spingard brothers' views on the lack of real action and radicalism behind Booker T. Washington. And at the end, it briefly mentions Marcus Garvey and how they also didn't like him very much for being too radical, like too extreme for them even, and not kind of going with the integrationalist view of Du Bois. But like I said, kind of a short chapter, so moving on. We get to chapter 17, which covers Leo Frank, the famous case in Georgia, in which a young girl is found murdered and mutilated in the factory that she works, where Leo Frank is the manager, who was later convicted of the crime, but then through a lot of deliberation, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment rather than the death penalty, because there was just a lot of back and forth evidence with the Frank defense saying it was Jim Conley, an African-American janitor, who perpetrated the murder. Basically, the case just caused a lot of controversy at the time. Frank was eventually lynched by a mob after the commutation of his sentence. He was later pardoned like decades later, so the kind of standard narrative is that he was falsely accused at the end of the day, and that it was more than likely Jim Conley. I'm not going to get too deep into the case. You could check out this Substack article by a fellow Mischling who kind of goes over this stuff. I mean, there have been other books written on the subject too, advocating for Leo Frank, and then obviously there's, again, like the Nation of Islam wrote a book or at least part of the book, a secret relationship between blacks and Jews, which exonerates Conley in their eyes. So yeah, you can make up your mind however you want on that, but that's just like the background of the case. I won't spend too much time on the chapter itself, because I really do think it boils down to who actually committed the crime. But obviously Jones thinks that Leo Frank was guilty, but more focuses on the Jewish response to the trials. So a lot of prominent Jews at the time kind of aroused sympathy and support for Leo Frank from the north of the country. People like Adolph Ochs, who ran the New York Times, and the businessman Albert Lasker. And while this did garner support for Frank in the North, especially among Jews, it really didn't help in the actual state of Georgia, and a lot of the population there felt like Northerners, not to mention Jews, were just kind of lording over and sticking their nose where it doesn't belong, more or less. And this whole controversy gave rise to not only the Anti-Defamation League, but also a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. So it was quite a big deal at the time. And there were just a lot of factors involved in this particular case. There's kind of like a northern-southern divide. There was like a Jewish anti-Semitism element, but also the black element in there with Jim Conley. So just like a lot of ins and outs, also elements of class rivalry and whatnot. So yeah, an interesting case. I mean, I personally think Jim Conley definitely did it, but you can figure that out on your own if you so choose. And just a couple quibbles with Jones, like he does actually get a couple things wrong. This was pointed out to me by the same author of the Substack article, but he does call Hugh Dorsey, one of the lawyers involved, Leo Dorsey, and he points to this scene in which Leo Frank's mother calls someone a Christian dog, but that didn't actually happen and was misreported. So there's just a couple things that I was told were not accurate. So I do think Jones sometimes takes kind of liberties with using hearsay and quotations and whatnot, but regardless, I won't spend too much more time on that. And lastly for this video, chapter 18, the spread of Bolshevism. Jones starts out describing the relationship between Germans and Jews and how they kind of teamed up to be anti-Russia during the First World War, culminating in Germany sending over Lenin along with others, predominantly Jewish apparently, to go to Russia to foment revolution. Jones makes a point that I've made in other videos that while Jews were disproportionately involved in a lot of the revolutionary movements, they were actually not as involved in the Bolshevik movement as they were in other ones at the time, but kind of flocked over to Bolshevism as that kind of won out. Now, I'll plug my other videos because I've done a lot on the kind of Judeo-Bolshevism stuff. I will say one should probably look at the context of the Russian Civil War, specifically at the book Russian Jews Between Reds and Whites, because I think that goes a long way in kind of explaining why Jews flocked to Bolshevism, because it was either going to join the commies, more or less, or being faced with the White Army and other proto-fascist, pro-monarchy, pro-czar groups who hated Jews. He also discusses people like Jacob Schiff and other Jewish financiers who helped support certain radical movements in Russia at the time. He seems to imply that they were responsible for the Bolsheviks themselves. I don't believe this was necessarily the case. I don't think Jacob Schiff, for example, directly supported the Bolsheviks. You can read about this in Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, which I've cited before in my other videos. But basically, Schiff supported the provisional government before the Bolsheviks took power, so there's just like a slight detail there that should be included. Not to say that Jacob Schiff wasn't an opponent of the Tsar, that definitely is true. And he also makes the statement that Lenin made anti-Semitism illegal in the USSR. Again, that's not really true. He did make a law that essentially made pogroms punishable by death, but that's not really the same thing as making anti-Semitism illegal, and there was just kind of generic legislation against ethnic hatred. To my knowledge, there wasn't like a specific legislation regarding anti-Semitism itself. I could be wrong about that. The only thing I'm aware of is that there's like a generic legislation against ethnic hatred and ethnic war, essentially, and straight out pogroming Jews, which is essentially just murder. So, but yeah, definitely the Bolsheviks were at times disproportionately Jewish. A lot of rank and file were Jews. Even more so in the short-lived Hungarian Revolution was overwhelmingly Jewish, which Jones alludes to. And he talks about people like Kurt Eisner, who were leaders in like German, Soviet, short-lived experiments, who incidentally was murdered by a half-Jewish guy who was like a proto-fascist. But yeah, definitely Jews were disproportionately involved in a lot of communist stuff, no question about it. And Jones has a criticism of Goldhagen's works, who wrote books such as Hitler's Willing Executioners, and criticizes Goldhagen for blaming the Catholic Church more or less for the Holocaust, while not using that same standard to blame Judaism or Jews as such for communism and the atrocities that communists committed. And Goldhagen apparently criticized a Catholic bishop for saying more or less that Jews were just like super involved in these revolutionary movements, which led to anti-Semitism. But essentially Jones was just saying, well, if that's true, then it shouldn't be a problem to state that. And even Jones kind of seems sympathetic to the fact that a lot of Jews were kind of lumped in with these Jewish Bolsheviks and were attacked or murdered or whatever as a result, but criticizes the notion that, okay, you can't blame all Jews, but on the other hand, all Catholics or all Germans are blamed for the atrocities of the Nazis, for example. Now, obviously, I would personally not do that. I would not blame all Germans or all Catholics or whatever. But, if that does happen, and I'm sure it has happened in the past, then that would be stupid. He also makes brief mention of the Frankfurt School, in which a lot of Jewish intellectuals involved in Marxist, postmodern critiques. Frankly, I'm not the best at deciphering their views, but essentially criticized a lot of Western culture's values and connected these values to the rise of fascism and Hitler and other undesirable things. And Jones ties us in with the spread of communist ideals, more or less, just to simplify it. And one of Jones's main points is that Hitler would not have risen to power had it not been for the Bolsheviks, because Hitler used the rise of the Bolsheviks and their connection to Jews to rile up the German nation as a bulwark against the kind of communist hordes led by a bunch of Jews. So essentially, no Bolshevism, no Hitler would have been much better. And certain Catholic bishops had both a anti-Nazi, also anti-communist worldview, but weren't afraid to name the Jew, as it were, but could criticize both at the same time. And by the late 30s, Stalin does a purge of Jews from the Soviet government, so by the late 30s, they are no longer in a disproportionate role. And yeah, just wanted to do those 3 chapters real quick, so I'll try and do the next 3 when I have time. See ya, thanks, bye.